Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to Trump Watch, the show that brings you all an up-to-date account of what President Trump has been up to during the past week. And he's been up to a lot, but that's not surprising. There's always things going on with President Trump from week to week. Let's begin with the subject of immigration. It's obviously the burning issue of our time. It's where President Trump is devoting a lot of his efforts. Y'all are familiar, of course, with President Trump sending a group of Venezuelan immigrants to El Salvador, where they were immediately incarcerated by the president of El Salvador and his forces, had their heads shaved, put into a prison that has a reputation for being extremely brutal, torture going on, and that sort of thing. And so I just want to bring you up to date. I know we discussed this in last week's Trump Watch and in last week's Libertarian Angle, but I just want to bring you up to date as to what's going on. The federal judge in the case, Judge James Boasberg, had issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting the Trump administration from sending these Venezuelan immigrants to El Salvador. And a temporary restraining order under federal procedural regulations can only last 14 days, and then it expires unless it's extended into what is called a temporary injunction. And a temporary restraining order can be issued without a hearing, but that's why it expires immediately unless there's a hearing. So a hearing was held, and Judge Boasberg extended the temporary restraining order into a temporary injunction, which lasts until the trial, or unless it's dissolved earlier, or unless it's overturned on appeal. Now, the Justice Department appealed the temporary restraining order to the Federal Court of Appeals, and they had a hearing, and they determined that the temporary restraining order that Judge Boasberg had entered should be upheld. So in a 2-1 decision, they upheld what he had done in issuing that temporary restraining order that he later has converted into a temporary injunction. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is appealing the Court of Appeals decision to the U.S. Supreme Court. I imagine that they'll take up that case rather quickly. But keep in mind something very important here, and it's really refreshing that a lot of lawyers in the mainstream press are pointing this out, that what is going on here is a direct attack on due process of law, that these immigrants were sent to El Salvador without notice, without hearing, without an opportunity to be heard, in direct violation of a principle that has been with our nation since almost its founding, with the Fifth Amendment, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which means notice and hearing. And it's a term that goes all the way back to Magna Carta in the 13th century. It developed over the centuries as part of the resistance to tyranny by the British king against his own citizens. So it's not just some kind of new doctrine that has suddenly popped up. And it applies to everybody. I mean, that's the beauty of our system. If you look at the Bill of Rights, it talks in terms of everyone, not just American citizens. Everyone is entitled to due process of law. And that's what they were denied, these Venezuelan immigrants. And the U.S. officials said, oh, well, they're gang members. They're part of a gang in Venezuela. But none of them were ever convicted of being gang members. If that's a criminal offense, I'm not sure whether being part of a gang in Venezuela is a criminal offense under U.S. law, but it might be because the U.S. is the world's policeman, so it wouldn't surprise me. But none of these people were ever charged or convicted of any kind of criminal offense dealing with gangs or drug trafficking or people trafficking. And many of them, or at least some of them, have family members that have recognized them on TV saying they're not part of any gang. And U.S. officials say, well, they must be because they have tattoos. Well, the family members are saying, well, yeah, they have tattoos, but that doesn't make them part of the gang. But see, that's the whole idea of due process, that if you have, even if it's just a short hearing before an immigration judge, somebody can say, I'm not part of that gang. Let me clarify this. Don't send me down there to El Salvador. Send me back to Venezuela, or don't send me to some brutal regime where I'm going to be incarcerated. Because, deportation generally involves throwing a person out of your country, evicting them. But it doesn't mean sending them down to another regime to be jailed and punished, especially when they haven't been prosecuted or convicted of anything. Now, you may say, well, they're here illegally. All right, so what's that have to do with being in jail in El Salvador? They certainly weren't convicted here in the United States of illegal entry. That's the whole point of due process of law, notice and hearing. And we linked to an article, or we posted an article this week by John Whitehead, who president of the Rutherford Institute, and I blogged on this, and the title of my blog was "The Heroic John Whitehead." I mean, Whitehead has been one of my real life heroes. He is so solid when it comes to defending civil liberties. He understands the importance of civil liberties, and I would invite you to read his article. We posted it Friday at fff.org. But if you haven't read it, it's fantastic. And his central point is the point that we've been making here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, practically since our inception. We had an issue of our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, devoted to the importance of civil liberties as far back as in the 1990s. And Whitehead points out that an attack on due process of law for foreigners is also an attack on due process of law for Americans. Because if they can get away with punishing people without due process of law, then they set the precedent, right? And once the precedent's set, it applies to everybody, and that's why it's imperative that we fight and defend the people who are being scapegoated in order to set a precedent that's going to apply to the rest of us. All right, now, so that kind of brings you up. Well, there's another aspect of the case that's still pending, very interesting aspect of the case, and that's the issue as to whether U.S. officials knowingly, intentionally, and deliberately violated the federal judge's order to not send those people to Venezuela. And his oral order said if they're in the plane, I order that plane to turn around. He didn't explicitly say that in the written order, but he made it clear that was part of his oral order. Well, the immigrants were delivered anyway, notwithstanding his order. And so the question is, had the planes already landed and the immigrants delivered into the clutches of El Salvador authorities when this order was issued? In other words, did they knowingly violate this order? And they've been dancing around it. It's pretty funny to watch these Justice Department lawyers. They've been dancing around this issue ever since, saying that they don't have to disclose to the judge what time the planes took off, and the judge is ordering them. I want to know. I want to get to the bottom of this as to whether you people violated this order on purpose. And they've just danced around it, said we're not going to disclose this. National security is at stake. I mean, they're clearly scared, because they know what's coming. If the facts show that they knowingly violated this judge's orders, we're talking about sanctions here now. Now y'all know U.S. officials love to put sanctions on foreign countries. Well, federal judges have the authority to put sanctions on officials here that violate their orders intentionally. And so they've been dancing around. We're not going to tell you. We can't tell you. And the latest is that the Justice Department lawyers have said, well, we're now claiming state secrets, that when these planes took off, it's state secrets. And this comes after they were claiming, well, foreign policy is involved. We have total power when it comes to foreign policy and so forth. And the judge is saying, I want to know. So the latest is that he's ordered the plaintiff's lawyer, who originally brought this case, to file a response to this state secrets claim. And then the judge will rule on whether this is a valid claim or whether it's a sham claim. And if he finds that it's a sham claim, then he's going to order them, or repeat his order, to disclose when those planes took off. And then we've got an interesting situation. Because if they refuse to comply with that order, then the judge has remedies. But that's where the interesting part comes in. One remedy is to impose a fine on some officials, whether it's the Justice Department lawyers that are doing all this clever dancing there in the courtroom, or some other official, until they disclose this information. Now, but what's a fine? You see, a fine, they just use taxpayer money for that. That's no penalty at all. It's no incentive to come forward and disclose the facts around this situation. So the only real remedy the judge has is to order somebody's incarceration. In other words, jail time, and indefinitely until they come forward. And the idea is that the inmate, the U.S. official in the jail, has the keys to his own release, because all he's got to do is, to get out of jail, is disclose the information. So that's how judges enforce these kind of orders. They order somebody to be jailed, and that person sits in jail until they disclose the information. So who would he jail? Well, it's not real clear. We have to see how things develop. Will the judge go that far? Well, we don't know. But if he doesn't, then what's the point of having issued the order anyway? If they could, with impunity, violate his original order and then violate his second order to disclose this information, then they can violate any order they want with impunity. Now, if he were to order the incarceration of somebody, clearly the Justice Department would appeal that order to the Court of Appeals, but I would assume that they would quickly rule on that, and maybe the case would reach the Supreme Court. Now, if we get to a point where the executive branch is saying, we're not going to comply with judges' orders at all, well, now we're in the land of dictatorship. You see, that's the Pinochet land. Remember I told you that conservatives love Pinochet. They just admire this guy, because when Pinochet, who was a brutal dictator, I mean, nobody denies that he was a dictator, when he took power, he didn't pay attention to what the judiciary did. They rolled over. The lawyers in the judiciary rolled over in Chile, and they confirmed whatever he wanted to do. So he had carte blanche to do whatever. I mean, he rounded up 50,000 people, never charged them with a crime, no due process of law, no trial, not even a trial before a tribunal or a judge. Just rounded them up and authorized his goons to start raping the women, and they raped women just brutally, and it's brutal sexual acts that are unspeakable that they did to women, and there was no court there to order them to stop or to order their release. And so that's where we would be if the executive branch were to say, we're not complying with court orders anymore. Now we're in the never land of dictatorship, where the dictator, like Pinochet, has full authority to do whatever he wants without interference. And there's right-wingers who want that kind of system. They hate the Constitution. They hate the Bill of Rights. They want the president to have whatever authority he wants to exercise to cleanse the nation of immigrants, to get rid of all the 12 million illegal immigrants and so forth, and that the judiciary should not be interfering with him because he's got a plan to win the war on immigrants. It's been going on for decades and decades. And but again, once there are no checks and balances, you don't need a legislative branch. I mean, notice that Trump, I don't think, has gone to Congress and asked for the enactment of any law. I could be mistaken on that, but it's all executive orders, raising tariffs, taxes, not by going to Congress and saying, will you raise this tariff or this tax, but just, I'm going to raise taxes here 25% or 10% or 15%. Now, he does it by declaring an emergency that Congress apparently delegated him the authority to declare an emergency and to raise tariffs on his own. But clearly that's unconstitutional, because Congress can't delegate its lawmaking authority to the executive branch or to the judicial branch, and vice versa. But you have this sense that we've got a ruler that's got the authority to issue these executive orders, and the only real check, Congress is no check at all. They're just a rubber stamp. The only real check to this authority is the judicial branch, and that's their job. That's been their job since the founding of the United States. is to examine whether an act is unconstitutional or not. Now, all three branches have that duty, but it's the judicial branch under our system of government that has that makes the ultimate call. And if they say, you have violated due process of law, you will stop this, then the president has to do that. And so far, Trump has said, I will comply with judicial orders. He knows that's our custom, that's our tradition, that's our legal system, our constitutional system. It's been here, since the founding of the United States in 1789. So I don't think we'll ever get to a point where he will do what a lot of right-wingers want him to do, and that is, I will not comply with the orders of the judiciary. Now, they'll try, in the Congress, they're trying to modify the power of federal judges. Some are saying that Boasberg should be impeached. This caused Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, to come back in with a severe rebuke and say that that's not the way our system works. If you don't like a ruling, you appeal the ruling, which the Justice Department has done. But you don't impeach and remove judges just because you don't like their rulings. Now, I'm not suggesting that Boasberg hasn't issued bad rulings in the past. I have a friend that's pointed out that he was one of the ones giving high jail sentences to the January 6th protesters. No question about it. Bad ruling, okay? But that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And just because a judge makes a bad ruling in one case doesn't mean that his other ruling that he makes, like in this case, is a bad one. In fact, the ruling that he has made in this case is a very valid one, very good one. And it protects all of us. It doesn't just protect immigrants. It protects all of us with respect to due process of law. Now, in this regard, I think we also should mention President Trump's executive orders against big law firms in Washington, D.C. Certain measures that he has taken, like stripping lawyers of security clearances or other aspects that he's going after him on. And two of the big firms have capitulated, and they've one agreed to give Trump $40 million in free legal help for causes that are important to President Trump. $40 million. Boy, that's a lot of legal services, I assume. I don't know how much they charge. But then another one who was apparently threatened or felt that they were going to be the subject of a similar type executive order. They reached out to Trump and gave him $100 million of free legal services. That's like $140 million of free legal services that President Trump has gotten in the last, couple of weeks here, a few weeks. Now, the good part of this is that there are firms fighting back. They're not capitulating. And one of the firms is a firm called Perkins Coie. And they said, we're fighting. Which is great. I mean, that's, lawyers are not supposed to be capitulating to this type of thing. And so they hired a very stout firm in Washington, D.C., who itself is courageous because they know they're taking a risk of being targeted for daring to represent Perkins Coie. And that firm is Williams and Conley, very, very renowned, big law firm in Washington, D.C. So they're representing Perkins Coie, and I could be mistaken, but I think they've gotten a temporary restraining order prohibiting the enforcement of the executive order against Perkins Coie. And then just recently, in the last few days, there's been an op-ed in the New York Times by a firm called Kecker, Van Nest, and Peters. I think they're based in D.C. too, big firm, that they're calling on all the big firms and all the lawyers to come to the defense of these firms that are fighting Trump's executive orders, and they're calling on firms to unite to file an amicus curiae brief before the courts in these cases, and in other words, banding together to show the illegitimacy of Trump's executive orders that have the potential effect of just destroying these law firms, There's also two other firms, Jenner and Block and Wilmer Hale. They have filed lawsuits challenging the administration's executive orders. So this is all a good thing that these firms are battling against what is going on here and Trump's actions against them. And it's a bad thing that some of these firms have capitulated to Trump's actions. Now, let's see what else has been going on. Well, let me talk a little bit about Venezuela. Let me return to Venezuela because Trump has now issued new sanctions against Venezuela. And these sanctions are ordering oil companies or people that are involved in the oil company to stop doing business with Venezuela. Well, for one thing, I mean, look at the kind of society in which we live. How does one man have the authority to order private sector companies to cease and desist from doing business in other countries? I mean, I don't see very many people questioning. It's like become normal. Well, of course the president has this authority. I mean, this is like a throwback to the old kings where people just accepted the notion that the king had authority to do whatever he wanted to people because they were the subjects. They were the peons. The king is the ruler. I mean, it was the whole idea behind Magna Carta that I mentioned earlier. Magna Carta, the barons of England said, enough of that mindset. And they extracted an acknowledgement from King John, their king, that his powers over them were limited. And the limit on the power was you cannot take away our liberty or our property or lives without due process of law. The term they used was in violation of the law of the land. But it was an acknowledgement. The king doesn't have omnipotent authority and over people. And so it just boggles the mind that nobody seems to be questioning this notion that the president of the United States can just order a company, you will not do business with Venezuela anymore. It's like, wow. But what he's doing, notice what is happening. That apparently Trump is upset over Maduro, the socialist president of Venezuela, who apparently lost a lax election, but because he controls the military, he's remained in power. And he won't accept immigrants that Trump wants to send back to Venezuela. Well, okay, for one thing, why did these immigrants leave Venezuela? It's like 7 million people or something. Well, because of two reasons. One is the massive violence gendered by the drug war, which the U.S. government supports. But two, the massive poverty, the economic conditions that socialism brought to Venezuela, along with U.S. sanctions. So you've got people in a vice. On one side of the vice, and the vice is tightening. And one side of the vice is the socialism. The other side of the vice is U.S. sanctions. And it's just squeezing the life out of the Venezuelan economy. So a lot of them, all these millions of people, they don't flee just because, let's go, move to a different country. They flee for their lives. It's either that or they stay there and starve to death. And their children starve to death. And they watch their children starve to death. Or they see their children being recruited into a drug gang. And there's nothing they can do about it. So they say, we got to get out of here. All right, so what could the U.S. do? Well, how about just leaving Venezuela alone? Lift all the sanctions. Okay, that way the economy is still in bad shape because of the socialism, but it's not as bad a shape that to such an extent that it forces those 7 or 8 million people to flee. And then when they come to the United States, what is the response of the U.S. government? Oh, you shouldn't have come here. You should have stayed back in Venezuela where you stood a good chance of dying. So they're trying to force these people back into Venezuela. And they create this aura of, they're all members of a gang. They're all members of a gang. Really? I mean, 7 million people who have fled the country were members of a gang? But nonetheless, Venezuela doesn't want them because they understand that the economic condition is so horrendous. They don't want mass starvation on their hands. And so the idea of more sanctions designed to squeeze the society even more, at the same time as trying to force Venezuelans back into this system, and then when they flee to the United States trying to save their lives, being castigated and condemned. What kind of society have we become in this country? I mean, people go to church every Sunday and pray to God, about being Christian and loving thy neighbor as thyself. And then how can anybody on Monday morning support this kind of system? Forcing people back into starvation, death by starvation. And then at the same time, squeezing the economy even more. It's horrendous. It's just brutal. To me, it shocks the conscience. It's just absolutely amazing. All right, what else has been going on here? Well, we've got Columbia University, where Trump was threatening the cutoff of $400 million. And it really, and they've capitulated. The interim president has resigned, and they said to Trump they're gonna go along with whatever his agenda is in the DEI and so forth, in return for hopefully getting the $400 million. But it really, in federal taxpayer money, it really goes to show you the damages that the Dole Society has done to America. I mean, once you're on the Dole, they've got you, especially if the Dole is a large amount of money. I guarantee you that Trump and the administration would never do anything like this to Hillsdale College because a court would immediately slap them down if they tried. Why? Because Hillsdale doesn't take any taxpayer money. He won't let students take taxpayer money. And so they're totally independent. They don't have to worry about these kind of orders. But if you're on the Dole, oh man, $400 million. I mean, of course, Columbia's got an endowment that could easily handle the loss of that. But the Dole mentality is, oh my gosh, we'll die without the Dole. We'll die without the Dole. And that's the power of the Dole. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And with the U.S. government, putting all these universities on the Dole, they're all scared to death. Oh my gosh, I got abandoned DEI. Which they were so committed to just a year ago because of fear of losing the Dole. Well, the fact is, in a free society, any university would be free to establish whatever hiring decisions it wants, admissions procedures it wants, policies. It's a private university. That's the way it should be. All education should be private. And the government should simply butt out of how universities run their business. Okay, finally, we only got a few minutes left, but let's talk about Greenland here, because there was a little dust stuff in Greenland. It was kind of funny that Vice President Vance's wife was going to go to Greenland and visit the capital city there, and there was a lot of uproar because they are not pleased with this notion that the United States is going to take control over Greenland. And so they rescheduled her visit to the U.S. military base somewhere in the northern part of the country. And then I guess the vice president didn't feel comfortable having his wife go to this military base by herself that's out in Timbuktu somewhere. So he ended up going with her to the military base, but avoiding the area where most people live, which I think consists of around 60,000 people or so. But you see, again, what does America have? What business does America have engaging in this type of thing that we need to take control over Greenland? It's just that empire mindset that guided, for example, America's entry into the Spanish-American War. Y'all know that I've really praised that period of time, 1880 to 1910, in terms of reaching very close to perfect libertarian principles. What? Not perfect. There were exceptions, Sherman antitrust law and Jim Crow and women's rights. But the exceptions were because of the statists. They weren't because of the libertarian philosophy. And one of the exceptions also was the Spanish-American War, because people were saying, oh, America can't be great unless it has colonies. That's the only way we can be great. And so we intervened in the war ostensibly to help these Spanish colonies get their independence from Spain. But then at the end of it, they said, U.S. officials said, well, sorry, we lied to you. You now belong to us. We're the new empire. And the Philippines kept fighting, and the U.S. killed, I don't know how many, 1 million Filipinos who were still fighting for their independence. And Cuba, that's how the U.S. got Guantanamo Bay, which is an imperial outpost. Puerto Rico, but you see, this is that mindset that we got to have colonies that provide us with raw raw materials, resources, and that's what the idea behind Greenland is. Oh, they have minerals there that can be furnished to us, and then we use the minerals to do finished products, and then we ship them out, and we'll have a favorable balance of trade. And oh my gosh, this is all this neo-mercantilist stuff that, I mean, any stout economist will tell you is just pure nonsense. But the fact that the U.S. is going down this empire road so overtly that we need to have Greenland. Oh, national security. The Russians are coming. The Chinese are coming. They might take Greenland first. And this is not what this country's about. And this is not what this country was supposed to be all about. In fact, when we talk about the issue of isolationism, it's important that we clarify what's going on here. The common notion of isolationism is when you're bringing the troops home from overseas, and that's pure nonsense. Isolationism is building walls around America and isolating the American people from the people of the world, like with immigration controls, with trade restrictions, tariffs. Just the idea is we're going to build a wall all around the country and we're going to be self-sufficient. That's isolationism, and it's very destructive, and especially economically. It's making things a lot worse for the American people. Things are going to get even more expensive than they already are. We can already see that with automobiles. But you bring all the troops home and you liberate the American people to interact with the people of the world. That's the ideal. But what we have, but that's what the status called isolationism, because you're bringing all the troops home. You're not having the U.S. government serve as the world's policeman. What the ideal is bring all the troops home, liberate the American people through the dismantling of tariffs, trade restrictions, sanctions, embargoes, immigration controls, and now you have a society that's based on freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. That's Trump Watch this week. Look forward to talking to you all next week.